Why Hard Work Doesn't Pay, Incentives, Visibility, and the Myth That Keeps People Obedient. Preface: The lie that feels like virtue. Few beliefs are as widely respected as the belief in hard work. Across cultures, generations, and political systems, diligence is praised as both a practical necessity and a moral virtue. People are told from childhood that effort will be noticed, that persistence will be rewarded, and that dedication will eventually lead to advancement. This belief carries enormous emotional weight. It allows people to interpret struggle as meaningful rather than arbitrary. It promises that even when conditions are difficult, effort itself has dignity. In uncertain environments, the idea that work leads somewhere provides stability. The difficulty is that the environments in which this belief originally developed no longer dominate modern economic life. In earlier eras, effort and output were visibly connected. A farmer who worked longer hours cultivated more land. A craftsperson who labored carefully produced more goods. The relationship between work and reward was not perfectly fair, but it was direct enough to feel credible. Effort produced tangible results that could be seen, counted, and traded. Modern institutions operate differently. Today, most work takes place inside systems where outcomes depend less on individual exertion and more on incentives, coordination, timing, and visibility. People contribute to processes whose results are distributed through layers of management, narrative, and perception. Under these conditions, effort is rarely the decisive factor, yet the language of hard work persists. It persists because it remains socially stabilizing. It encourages reliability, it encourages compliance, it encourages people to continue investing energy even when the connection between effort and advancement weakens. Hard work becomes not just a method of survival, but a moral identity. This identity is difficult to question. To doubt the payoff of hard work can feel like doubting one's own character. It feels disloyal to the values people were raised with and to the effort they have already invested. Many prefer to work harder rather than examine whether the system itself distributes reward differently than they were taught. The result is a quiet contradiction. People exert enormous effort in environments where effort alone cannot determine outcome. When advancement fails to follow, the explanation is often internalized. Workers assume they must not be working hard enough or not working correctly. This book examines that contradiction. It does not argue that effort is useless. Effort still produces competence, discipline, and resilience. What it challenges is the assumption that effort alone determines who advances and who remains contained. Modern systems reward alignment with incentives, visibility at key moments, and the ability to create leverage within structures of power. These dynamics are rarely explained explicitly because the myth of hard work continues to perform an important function. It keeps the system stable. Understanding this does not require cynicism. It requires clarity. Once the difference between labor and leverage becomes visible, many experiences that once felt confusing begin to make structural sense. This book attempts to make those structures legible. Part 1: The Promise. Chapter 1: Where the Idea of Hard Work Came From. Hard work did not begin as a deception. It began as a practical observation about survival. In environments where output was tied directly to physical effort, agriculture, craft production, early manufacturing, the connection between work and reward was relatively transparent. The person who labored longer produced more. The person who produced more could trade more, store more, and survive more reliably. This relationship was not perfectly fair. Land ownership, inheritance, and social hierarchy shaped outcomes long before modern economics existed. Yet the immediate link between exertion and result gave effort a credibility that made moral sense. Over time, this practical observation hardened into a cultural rule. Communities began to treat diligence not only as a survival skill, but as a sign of character. The hard-working individual was trustworthy. The idle individual was suspect. Religious traditions reinforced this connection, framing work as discipline, duty, and virtue. The rule survived because it was broadly useful. For families and communities, encouraging effort increased productivity. For emerging industrial economies, it produced a reliable workforce. For institutions, it offered a moral language that aligned personal identity with economic necessity. But the environments that produced the rule have largely disappeared. In modern organizations, effort rarely maps directly to outcome. Workers operate within systems of incentives that determine what behavior is rewarded and what behavior is absorbed without recognition. Contribution is filtered through management structures, political narratives, and institutional priorities. The connection between labor and advancement has become indirect. Despite this change, the language of hard work persists. It persists because moral beliefs change more slowly than economic structures. People continue to interpret their experience through a framework developed under different conditions. This persistence produces a strange dynamic. Workers continue to invest in effort as if it were the decisive variable, while systems distribute rewards according to different mechanisms. The myth survives because it remains partially true. Hard work still produces competence, it still builds resilience, it still improves performance. But competence does not automatically produce leverage. Systems require competent workers to operate smoothly. They do not necessarily reward those workers with autonomy or advancement. In many cases, competence makes individuals more valuable exactly where they are. By the time people recognize this distinction, their identity may already be intertwined with the idea of effort. They take pride in being dependable, diligent, and responsible. To question the payoff of hard work then feels like questioning their own integrity. What began as a survival principle becomes something harder to examine, and this is how a practical rule evolves into a structural trap. Chapter 2. Why it still feels true. If hard work no longer determines advancement reliably, why does the belief remain so convincing? One reason is intermittent reinforcement. Incentive systems do not ignore effort entirely. Some hardworking individuals do succeed. Some organizations do reward diligence. Promotions occasionally follow sustained effort. These examples are visible and memorable, reinforcing the belief that the rule still operates. But they function more as exceptions than as guarantees. Stories of effort rewarded are repeated widely because they are emotionally satisfying. They validate the cultural narrative that diligence eventually pays off. Meanwhile, the far more common stories of effort that maintain stability without changing position remain invisible. This imbalance creates a distorted perception of probability. Hard work also produces signals that feel like progress even when structural position remains unchanged. Workers receive praise. They gain responsibility. Their supervisors trust them. These experiences generate the sense of advancement. In reality, responsibility and autonomy are not the same. Responsibility often increases precisely because someone is dependable. Systems place greater operational weight on reliable individuals. The worker becomes more essential to daily functioning while remaining structurally replaceable. From the outside, this looks like recognition. From the inside, it can feel like deepening commitment. Another reason the belief persists is psychological. Effort provides meaning. In environments where outcomes appear arbitrary or controlled by distant forces, working hard offers a sense of dignity. Even when results disappoint, individuals can take pride in their effort. This emotional benefit is significant. Hard work allows people to maintain self-respect even when the system fails to reward them materially. It provides a narrative that protects identity from the unpredictability of institutional decision-making. Institutions reinforce this narrative deliberately. Performance systems emphasize activity, responsiveness, and reliability because these behaviors are easy to measure. Metrics capture output volume, meeting attendance, response times, and compliance with procedures. Leverage, timing, and strategic restraint are much harder to measure. As a result, workers learn to equate visible activity with value. They experience their own effort directly while remaining largely unaware of the incentive structures shaping reward distribution. When advancement fails to follow effort, the default explanation becomes internal. The worker concludes that they must simply work harder. The myth persists not because it is entirely false, but because it is emotionally stabilizing and institutionally convenient. It keeps individuals invested in effort long after the conditions that once guaranteed reward have disappeared. And that persistence is precisely what makes the myth useful. Part 2. The Reality. Chapter 3. Incentives don't care about effort. Effort is personal. Incentives are structural. Confusing the two leads many capable people to work tirelessly without altering their position. Modern institutions do not evaluate work primarily in terms of exertion. They evaluate behavior in terms of alignment with incentives. Incentives shape outcomes regardless of how sincerely or intensely individuals perform their roles. An incentive is simply a directional force embedded within a system. It rewards certain behaviors and discourages others, often without anyone consciously intending the outcome. When incentives reward speed, speed rises. When incentives reward compliance, compliance dominates. When incentives reward visibility, visible actions multiply. Effort that pushes against incentives is not necessarily punished, but it is rarely rewarded. It is absorbed. This explains why hard-working individuals frequently experience a mismatch between contribution and advancement. They solve problems, improve efficiency, and stabilize operations, yet their position remains unchanged. The system has already extracted the value it needs. Additional effort improves output but does not alter the incentive structure that determines promotion, authority, or compensation. By contrast, individuals who understand the incentive structure may appear less diligent but advance more rapidly. They concentrate their effort on actions that align with what the system already rewards. The difference is not always intelligence or ambition, it is alignment. Organizations often speak the language of merit while operating through incentives. Merit is narrative. Incentives are mechanics. When the two diverge, mechanics determine the outcome. Hard work that strengthens the system without altering its power distribution is welcomed. Hard work that disrupts established incentives may be ignored or quietly discouraged. This is not necessarily malicious. Systems evolve to preserve stability. Workers who deliver reliable performance without demanding structural change fit easily into that design. Their effort improves the system while leaving their own leverage unchanged. Understanding incentives requires stepping outside the moral language surrounding work. Effort should be evaluated not only by how much output it produces, but by whether it shifts one's position within the structure. Otherwise, effort becomes a form of maintenance. Chapter 4. Visibility beats contribution. Contribution improves systems. Visibility moves people within them. Modern organizations reward what can be seen, narrated, and remembered. Contribution that operates quietly in the background often disappears from the narrative of advancement. Visibility does not require blatant self-promotion. It involves ensuring that actions are legible to those who allocate resources, recognition, and opportunity. A task completed efficiently may go unnoticed. A task framed as leadership may define a career. Hardworking individuals often prioritize completion over exposure. They finish assignments, solve problems, and move immediately to the next responsibility. Their focus is operational rather than narrative. Visibility-oriented actors behave differently. They pause. They frame their actions. They communicate outcomes in ways that connect their work to institutional goals. Over time, these signals accumulate. Visibility also interacts with crisis. When systems operate smoothly, the labor maintaining stability remains largely invisible. When disruption occurs, the individuals who publicly resolve the disruption become visible. The system rewards those associated with moments of change more readily than those who quietly prevented failure. Another dynamic emerges from indispensability. Workers who perform essential operational tasks too well can become difficult to replace. Promoting them would create operational gaps. As a result, the system has an incentive to keep them exactly where they are. Contribution becomes containment. Visibility operates differently. It signals leadership potential rather than operational necessity. Systems are often more comfortable promoting individuals whose absence will not immediately destabilize daily operations. Many people resist visibility because it feels performative or dishonest. They believe that contribution should speak for itself. In reality, systems cannot reward what they cannot categorize. Visibility functions as translation. It converts action into narrative and narrative into advancement. Contribution without visibility improves the system, but rarely improves the worker's position within it. Part 3. The Trap. Chapter 5. How Effort Becomes Containment. Effort becomes containment when it solves problems too well. At first, this looks like success. The hard-working person becomes known as dependable, competent, and calm under pressure. They handle complexity. They absorb friction. They notice what others miss and close gaps before those gaps become visible failures. In almost any organization, this earns trust quickly. Trust, however, is not the same as movement. Systems adapt to reliability. When someone repeatedly prevents disruption, the system reorganizes around that person's capacity. What began as contribution gradually becomes infrastructure. The person is no longer simply doing good work. They are keeping the structure from feeling its own weaknesses. This transition is rarely acknowledged openly because it feels positive while it is happening. More responsibility arrives. Praise increases. Managers lean more heavily on the person. Colleagues defer. The worker experiences these changes as evidence of value, and in one sense they are. But value inside a system does not automatically convert into leverage over that system. Often it does the opposite. The more effectively someone contains friction, the less incentive the organization has to alter the conditions producing that friction. Why redesign a process if a reliable person keeps compensating for its failures? Why redistribute burden if one individual continues absorbing it without forcing consequence upward? In this way, effort becomes a hidden stabilizer. The hard-working employee thinks they are proving themselves. The organization experiences them as a low-cost solution to recurring instability. The employee interprets increased dependence as growing importance. The system interprets it as operational efficiency. This is where containment begins to harden. The individual starts developing depth instead of range. They know their corner of the system intimately. They become essential to continuity but less visible elsewhere. Their expertise grows narrower and more contextual. This makes them harder to replace in the short term, but also harder to reposition in the long term. The person who solves everything in one environment gradually loses room to be seen as capable beyond it. Containment is strengthened by identity. Hardworking people often see themselves as responsible, useful, and dependable. They take justified pride in being the person others can trust. That pride is not false, but it can become a mechanism through which the system secures ongoing compliance. Refusal begins to feel like moral failure. Withdrawal feels like irresponsibility. Reducing effort feels like betrayal, not merely of the employer, but of the self. This is one reason containment is so difficult to detect while it is forming. It is emotionally rewarded. The person feels needed, and being needed is easier to interpret than being strategically stalled. Over time, however, a plateau emerges. There is no obvious conflict, no major rupture, no clear injustice dramatic enough to provoke resignation. Instead, progress simply slows. The person remains trusted, busy, and relied upon, but their position changes very little. Additional effort no longer increases optionality, it merely increases load-bearing capacity. At that point, hard work stops functioning as mobility and starts functioning as containment. This is one of the central hidden costs of modern work systems. They do not always exploit by punishing effort. Often they exploit by rewarding it just enough to keep it in place. The person is not excluded. They are optimized around, and optimization is harder to resist than rejection because it feels like appreciation. To see this clearly requires a shift in perspective. The question is no longer whether effort is producing output. It almost certainly is. The question is whether effort is changing position, expanding options, or reducing dependence. If it is not, then the work may still be useful, but it is no longer strategic. At that point, continued effort without redesign becomes a form of self-containment. Chapter 6. The Reliable Worker Problem. Reliability is one of the most praised traits in organizational life and one of the most dangerous when left unmanaged. Reliable workers are easy to trust. They answer messages, meet deadlines, complete assignments, and show up when others begin to disappear. They do not create unnecessary chaos. They reduce uncertainty for everyone around them. These qualities are genuinely valuable. Most organizations would function poorly without them. The problem is not that reliability is punished. The problem is that reliability is harvested. Once a system recognizes that someone is consistently dependable, work begins flowing toward that person almost automatically. Colleagues defer to them because they know the task will be handled properly. Managers route problems in their direction because doing so lowers risk. Over time, the reliable worker becomes a concentration point for unresolved responsibilities. This concentration creates a quiet contradiction. The same traits that make someone trustworthy also reduce their slack. Their calendar fills. Their interruptions multiply. Their cognitive bandwidth gets consumed by operational demands. Reliability produces obligation faster than it produces leverage, and advancement requires slack. To move upward or outward inside a system, a person typically needs some combination of time, visibility, and room for experimentation. They must be able to step back from immediate execution long enough to shape perception, build alternatives, or reposition themselves strategically. Reliability erodes this capacity. The more dependable someone is, the harder it becomes for the organization to imagine functioning without them in their current role. This is why reliable workers are often praised intensely while being moved very little. They are described as essential, trusted, or invaluable. Yet these descriptions often mask a structural reality. The organization has become too comfortable with their current placement to risk changing it. Reliability becomes the reason not to move them. The person then responds in the most intuitive way possible. Seeing that their work is appreciated, they increase effort. They solve more problems, make themselves even more useful, and assume that undeniable excellence will eventually force recognition. But this deepens the trap. The more the system depends on someone's reliability, the more disruptive their absence appears. Promotion, reassignment, or increased autonomy begin to look operationally expensive. The organization may value the person deeply while still preferring to keep them exactly where they are. This dynamic is especially painful because it feels morally coherent while being strategically damaging. Reliable workers are often the kinds of people who want to be useful. They identify with responsibility. They dislike dropping the ball. They believe, often sincerely, that work should be done well simply because it ought to be done well. These values make them strong. They also make them easy to stabilize. Without boundaries, reliability becomes indistinguishable from availability, and availability is one of the most underpriced resources in modern work culture. The system rarely asks whether the reliable person should carry more. It simply discovers that they can and proceeds accordingly. Over time, this creates a pattern in which reliability no longer signals trustworthiness alone. It signals absorbability. The person becomes the default answer to every gap in the structure. That default status can feel like importance. Sometimes it even produces short-term security, but it often reduces long-term freedom. The reliable worker is not necessarily advancing. They are being used as shock absorption for institutional uncertainty. Breaking this pattern does not require becoming unreliable in the crude sense. It requires changing the meaning of reliability. The worker must become dependable within limits rather than infinitely available. Response time must stop being automatic. Every request must stop receiving the same moral weight. Reliability must be paired with selectivity, or it turns into a leash. This is difficult because the culture around work treats reliability as pure virtue. To limit it feels selfish. To pace it feels disloyal. To withhold it feels like abandoning standards. But standards that consume optionality eventually turn against the person holding them. The deeper lesson is uncomfortable. Systems do not reward the person who carries the most weight. They reward the person whose weight-bearing is strategically expensive to lose and strategically visible to replace. Reliability alone does not create that condition. Unmanaged reliability creates obedience with good branding. Part 4. Who actually advances? Chapter 7. Leverage, not labor. Labor produces output. Leverage changes position. This distinction is easy to state and difficult to internalize because most people are trained to believe that sustained labor will eventually generate leverage on its own. They assume that if they contribute enough, stay long enough, and become competent enough, bargaining power will follow naturally. Sometimes it does. More often, it does not. Modern systems are designed to extract labor efficiently while limiting the spontaneous formation of leverage among those who provide it. This does not require explicit conspiracy. It is a structural preference. Organizations want skilled people, but they prefer those people to remain predictable, substitutable, and dependent enough to continue supplying output on familiar terms. Labor is continuous. It must be repeated. Its value decays quickly if it is not renewed through new effort. Leverage, by contrast, is durable. It changes the ratio between action and consequence. It allows smaller actions to produce larger effects and sometimes allows inaction itself to retain value. Ownership is leverage. Scarcity is leverage. Control over timing is leverage. The ability to walk away without collapse is leverage. Most workers possess labor and mistake it for leverage because labor is exhausting enough to feel powerful. If one is carrying large responsibilities, solving difficult problems, and functioning at a high level, it feels natural to assume that real power must follow. But systems are perfectly capable of consuming highly skilled labor while preventing it from changing position. This is one reason overwork is so deceptive. It creates the sensation of significance. The worker is busy, needed, and often praised, yet none of this necessarily increases their freedom to renegotiate terms. In many cases, it decreases it by making their output indispensable in the short term and their absence politically inconvenient. Labor sustains the machine. Leverage influences the machine. These are not the same function. Leverage threatens predictability. A worker with real alternatives, visible scarcity, or ownership over critical transitions cannot be managed as easily as one who merely works hard. This is why systems tend to reward labor enough to secure participation while withholding the kinds of conditions that would allow labor to become structurally autonomous. Comfort becomes the substitute for power. People are paid enough to remain invested, recognized enough to remain hopeful, and kept busy enough to remain contained. They interpret this as progress. In many cases, it is maintenance. Building leverage often requires reducing visible labor rather than intensifying it. This feels deeply counterintuitive, especially to conscientious people. Stepping back can feel like underperforming. Withholding energy can feel like negligence. Yet, without some form of scarcity, the system has no reason to treat your contribution as negotiable rather than automatic. The worker who is always available trains the system to assume continuity. The worker who is selectively present forces recalculation. This is not a call to become theatrical or manipulative. It is a call to stop confusing effort with structural position. Hard work can build leverage, but only if it is directed toward assets, relationships, visibility, ownership, and timing structures that outlast the next cycle of output. Otherwise, labor remains what it has always been inside most large systems: necessary, useful, and politically cheap. Those who actually advance are not always those who work the hardest. Often, they are those who understand where labor ends and leverage begins. Chapter 8: Timing, Risk, and Strategic Withdrawal. Timing is one of the least visible multipliers in career and organizational life. The same action taken at different moments can produce opposite outcomes. A proposal introduced too early is ignored. The same proposal introduced during instability becomes leadership. A departure made under pressure appears reckless. The same departure made after alternatives are prepared appears strategic. Hard work often ignores timing because it is organized around consistency. The worker shows up, performs, and assumes that sustained effort will eventually be recognized. This assumption treats time as neutral. It is not. Systems change unevenly. They remain stable for long stretches and then shift suddenly. Those most deeply embedded in immediate obligations often miss the moment when repositioning becomes possible because they are too busy maintaining continuity. This is where risk enters. Risk is not something that can be eliminated. It can only be shaped. Most workers absorb risk continuously through dependency, income concentration, role-specific identity, high fixed costs, and limited exit options. This form of risk feels normal because it is stable. Yet, it is often more dangerous than episodic strategic risk. Strategic actors handle risk differently. They do not attempt to remove uncertainty. They attempt to control its form. They accept temporary ambiguity in exchange for preserving the ability to move later. They allow some opportunities to remain unresolved. They keep commitments lighter than the environment encourages. They preserve optionality before they need it. From the outside, this can look like hesitation. In reality, it is preparation. Strategic withdrawal is one of the most misunderstood tools in this process. It is often interpreted as disengagement, laziness, or lack of commitment. But withdrawal is not always absence of effort. Often, it is the deliberate refusal to let effort become total. To withdraw strategically is to refuse automatic availability. It is to stop solving every problem, answering every request instantly, or allowing one's identity to fuse completely with a role. Withdrawal restores perspective. It creates observational distance. It prevents the system from treating one's energy as free infrastructure. This matters because over-identification is one of the fastest ways to lose timing. The person who becomes inseparable from their function cannot reposition easily. Their obligations become too dense. Their self-concept becomes too entangled. Even when the right moment to move appears, they may be unable to act because the psychological and operational costs of change have become too high. By contrast, those who have preserved slack often look lucky when openings emerge. They leave at the right time, accept the right role, or seize the right opportunity. But what appears as luck is often the result of earlier restraint. They did less when doing less preserved movement. Timing rewards those who remain movable. Risk becomes survivable when not all resources are already committed. Withdrawal, in this context, is not retreat. It is the maintenance of distance required for strategic timing to exist at all. A person who is everywhere, needed by everyone, and instantly responsive to every institutional demand may appear admirable. They are also easy to trap. The person who can step back, withhold, and reassess is harder to absorb. That hardness is not cruelty, it is preserved maneuverability. Hard work without timing exhausts. Hard work with timing can compound. But timing cannot be used by those who have surrendered every margin to the present. Strategic withdrawal is therefore not an optional refinement for ambitious people. In many systems, it is the only way effort stops being consumed and begins to acquire direction. Part 5: Reframing Work. Chapter 9: When Work Makes Sense. Work makes sense when it alters future position. That is the standard most people rarely use because they are taught to evaluate work morally rather than structurally. They ask whether they are being diligent, loyal, or responsible. They ask whether they are trying hard enough. They ask whether they are fulfilling expectations. These questions are not trivial, but they often obscure the more important one. Does this work change anything about my leverage, optionality, or exposure? In the early stages of a role or career, work often makes sense by default. Skills are being built, signals are being sent. The individual is learning how the system actually functions, who matters, what is rewarded, and which forms of effort translate into political or economic movement. During this phase, labor can compound indirectly through competence, literacy, and credibility. The danger is that this phase often ends quietly. No one announces that the learning curve has flattened or that the role has shifted from developmental to containership. The work continues, the praise may continue, the effort certainly continues, but position stops changing. The person is no longer converting work into future freedom. They are converting it into present maintenance. At that point, work may still be socially respectable and operationally useful. It may even be personally meaningful in certain respects, but strategically, something has changed. Work also makes sense when it is clearly transitional. There are periods in which intense labor is justified because it buys something real: exit, portability, financial buffer, reputation with transfer value, or access to structures otherwise unavailable. The issue is not intensity. The issue is conversion. If effort is temporary and deliberately tied to a future shift in position, it may be entirely rational. The problem begins when work remains intense but loses any clear conversion into leverage. Then the person is no longer climbing or repositioning. They are simply sustaining motion. Motion can feel reassuring because it postpones the need to ask whether the system is still returning anything meaningful for the effort being spent. Work that makes sense is bounded. It has criteria, limits, and an end point. It is periodically reassessed rather than morally defended. The worker remains willing to slow, redirect, or stop if the conditions that once justified the labor have changed. This willingness is rare because many people attach self-worth to endurance. To admit that work no longer makes sense feels like admitting that earlier effort was misplaced. Continuing feels easier than reassessment, even when continuing produces stagnation. Understanding when work makes sense restores proportion. It turns effort back into a tool. The person is no longer working merely because work is virtuous. They are working because the labor changes something about future life. That distinction matters. Without it, effort becomes ritual. With it, work regains direction. Chapter 10. When it stops. Work stops making sense when additional effort no longer alters outcomes. This does not mean the work has become pointless in every sense. It may still generate income. It may still preserve identity. It may still maintain a life that has become expensive to sustain. But once effort ceases to improve leverage, optionality, or long-term position, it changes category. It becomes maintenance. Maintenance is not shameful. Every adult life contains some of it. The danger lies in mistaking maintenance for advancement. One sign that work has stopped making sense is a persistent gap between exertion and movement. The person remains constantly busy but feels increasingly compressed. More work produces more demand, not more freedom. Another sign is moral language beginning to replace strategic language. Effort is defended as responsibility, professionalism, or loyalty, even when the structure no longer returns anything proportionate. This is often the stage at which people intensify effort rather than reconsidering it. They assume the solution to stalled progress must be greater exertion. But if the system is already using their effort as containment, increasing labor only stabilizes the trap. At this point, effort becomes self-harm disguised as virtue. Work also stops making sense when visibility overtakes impact. Meetings multiply, communication expands, outputs become more performative. The worker is active, praised, and exhausted, yet nothing substantive shifts in their position. The organization feels smoother. The person feels emptier. The proper response here is not necessarily dramatic exit. Often the first move is quieter and more difficult. Reassessment. Which forms of effort still alter conditions? Which forms simply preserve equilibrium? Where is labor still being converted into anything durable? Where is it merely subsidizing the comfort of others? These questions are uncomfortable because they require detaching identity from work. Many people fear that if they stop defending effort morally, they will become lazy or disloyal. In reality, they may simply become strategic for the first time. Stopping, reducing, or redirecting work under such conditions feels dangerous because it violates deeply internalized beliefs. It can feel like selfishness, it can feel like wasted potential, but often it is the first rational act in a long time. It creates observation, it restores slack, it reveals what the system actually values rather than what it claims to value. This is a form of intelligence rarely taught and often punished. Systems prefer workers who never ask whether the work still makes structural sense. Those who do ask begin to reclaim agency because they are no longer treating effort as sacred. Once that question becomes available, everything changes, not always dramatically, not immediately, but decisively. The person begins working in relation to conditions rather than in obedience to myth. And that is often the first moment real movement becomes possible again. Closing chapter: Working without being used. Working without being used does not mean refusing effort. It means refusing to confuse effort with advancement, reliability with leverage, or praise with movement. Modern systems do not primarily reward sacrifice. They reward alignment with incentives, visibility at key moments, strategic scarcity, and the ability to convert labor into structural position. Effort offered without those mediating conditions is rarely repaid in proportion to its cost. This is not because hard work is worthless. It is because hard work now functions inside environments very different from the ones that gave it moral authority. The older promise was simple: work hard, and the world will open. The modern reality is harder: work hard, and the system may simply become more comfortable using you unless your effort changes something about your leverage. That is the distinction this book has traced. Incentives do not care about sincerity. Visibility often outperforms contribution. Reliability becomes harvestable. Labor and leverage diverge. Timing matters more than consistency is allowed to admit, and there comes a point at which continuing to work the same way is no longer noble. It is merely costly. Working without being used begins with literacy, seeing where effort compounds and where it is merely absorbed, seeing where contribution creates future room and where it only stabilizes someone else's advantage. Once those distinctions become visible, effort can be shaped rather than simply spent. That shaping requires restraint. Not every problem should be solved. Not every request should be met. Not every role should be occupied fully simply because one can occupy it well. Scarcity has to enter the picture somewhere, or leverage never forms. This posture will not usually be celebrated. It resists the moral storytelling that makes institutions feel legitimate. It looks selective, unspectacular, and at times even disappointing to observers who still believe effort is self-justifying. But without that selectivity, work easily becomes consumption. It consumes time, attention, identity, and future options while telling the worker they are being virtuous. That is one of the oldest tricks in modern organizational life, to frame extraction as character. The aim is not to escape work entirely, it is to restore its meaning, to make sure labor is tied to movement, not merely to maintenance, to preserve the ability to refuse, to ensure that one's effort still has shape, direction, and consequence beyond the next cycle of output. Working without being used is not rebellion, it is literacy. And in systems built on misaligned incentives, literacy is one of the few reliable forms of power.